The young lookout aboard the battleship Yamato pressed his binoculars against his eyes, scanning the gray April sky above the East China Sea. For a moment, the clouds seemed peaceful, drifting lazily across the morning horizon. Then he saw them, dark shapes emerging from the overcast like vengeful spirits. Dozens of American aircraft, their engines growing louder by the second. His throat went dry as he reached for the alarm bell, but before his hand could strike it, the first bombs were already screaming down. The deck beneath his feet erupted in flames and twisted metal. The mighty Yamato, pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, shuddered like a wounded beast. As fires raged around him and the great ship began to list, seawater rushing over the starboard rail, the lookout knew he was witnessing the end of an era. He jumped into the churning sea just as the magazine exploded behind him, sending the largest battleship ever built to her grave in a thunderous roar that could be heard for miles. But this story truly begins 3 days earlier, through the eyes of an American Navy pilot who would help deliver that crushing blow. April 4th, 1945. The flight deck of the USS Bunker Hill rolled gently beneath my boots as I made my way to the ready room. The morning sun cast long shadows across the carrier's deck, where dozens of Helldivers and Corsairs sat waiting like sleeping birds of prey. I'd been flying combat missions for 8 months now, but something about today felt different. The tension in the air was thicker than usual, crackling with an electricity that made every sailor move with purpose. Inside the ready room, the atmosphere was electric. Commander Johnson stood at the front, his weathered face grave as he waited for the last few pilots to file in. Behind him hung a large map of the Japanese home islands, with red pins marking enemy positions and blue arrows showing our planned approach routes. The sight of that map always sent a chill down my spine. We were so close to Japan now that you could almost smell the fear in the enemy's desperate moves. "Gentlemen," Commander Johnson began, his voice cutting through the nervous chatter, "what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room until after the mission. Intelligence has confirmed that the Japanese are making one final desperate gambit." He turned to the map and pointed to a position southwest of Kyushu. At approximately 1500 hours yesterday, a Japanese task force departed Okinawa Naval Base. Leading this force is the battleship Yamato. The room fell dead silent. Every pilot in that ready room knew the name Yamato. At 72,000 tons, fully loaded and armed with 9 massive 18.1-inch guns, she was the largest and most powerful battleship ever built. Her armor was so thick that our standard bombs barely scratched her paint. For 3.5 years of war, she'd been the white whale that had eluded every American attack. The Yamato is accompanied by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, Johnson continued. Their destination is Okinawa, where they intend to beach the Yamato and use her as an unsinkable gun platform to destroy our invasion fleet. I felt my heart rate increase. The battle for Okinawa had been raging for 4 days now, and every American serviceman in the Pacific knew what was at stake. It was our final stepping stone to Japan itself. If the Japanese could destroy our fleet there with Yamato's massive guns, it would set back the entire invasion timeline by months, maybe years. Johnson's next words sent a jolt of adrenaline through every man in the room. This task force has enough fuel for a one-way trip only. They're calling it Operation Tengo, a suicide mission. The Japanese are so desperate that they're willing to sacrifice their most prized warship and 3,300 sailors in a kamikaze attack. Lieutenant Morrison raised his hand. "Sir, what's our role in stopping them?" The commander's smile was grim but determined. Task Force 58 is launching the largest carrier airstrike in naval history. Over 400 aircraft from 11 carriers will hunt down and sink the Yamato before she can reach Okinawa. This is it, gentlemen. This is our chance to remove the biggest threat in the Japanese Navy once and for all. As he spoke, I could feel the weight of history settling on my shoulders. We'd fought our way across the Pacific for 3.5 years, island by bloody island. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, the Philippines, Iwo Jima. Each battle had brought us closer to this moment. Now the Japanese were throwing their last desperate punch, and it was up to us to stop it. The strike will be divided into 2 waves, Johnson explained. moving his pointer across the map. The first wave launches at 1,000 hours and consists of 280 aircraft. The second wave launches at 1,500 hours with 106 additional planes. Our job is to locate, engage, and destroy the Japanese task force before they can reach the transport area off Okinawa. He paused, letting the magnitude of the mission sink in. Intelligence estimates the Yamato will be approximately 200 miles southwest of Kyushu by the time we reach her. Weather conditions are poor, with thick cloud cover and intermittent rain squalls. Visibility will be limited, so stay tight on your wing leaders and watch your fuel consumption. The briefing continued for another 30 minutes as Johnson went over recognition silhouettes, attack patterns, and emergency procedures. But my mind was already racing ahead to the mission itself. I'd never seen a battleship as massive as the Yamato, let alone attacked one. Our SB2C Helldivers carried 1,000-pound bombs that could sink a destroyer or cripple a cruiser, but against Yamato's massive armor belt, we'd need to score direct hits on vulnerable areas like the deck or superstructure to cause any real damage. As the briefing ended and pilots began filing out to prepare their aircraft, I caught Johnson's eye. "Sir, what are our chances of actually sinking her?" The commander studied me for a long moment before answering. "Son, the Yamato has the thickest armor of any warship ever built. Her main belt is over 16 inches thick, and her deck armor can stop almost anything we can throw at her. But every ship has weak points, the superstructure, the stern, areas where the armor is thinner. More importantly, we're not going after her alone. With over 400 aircraft hitting her from multiple directions, even the mighty Yamato won't be able to withstand that kind of concentrated attack." He placed a hand on my shoulder. "Remember, this isn't just about sinking one ship. The Japanese people have been told that the Yamato is unsinkable, that she represents the invincible spirit of their empire. When she goes down, it'll be a psychological blow that will echo throughout Japan. They'll know that if we can sink their greatest battleship, nothing can stop us from taking their homeland." The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. I spent time in the maintenance hangar, going over every system in my Helldiver with Chief Petty Officer Martinez, a grizzled mechanic who'd been keeping Navy planes flying since before Pearl Harbor. "She's purring like a kitten," Martinez said, patting the engine, cowling affectionately. "Fresh oil, clean spark plugs, and I personally loaded that 1,000-pounder in her belly. You just get her over the target, Lieutenant, and she'll do the rest." I climbed into the cockpit and ran through my pre-flight checklist one more time. Everything had to be perfect. There would be no second chances on this mission. The stick felt solid in my hands, the rudder pedals responsive under my feet. The engine instruments all showed green, and the radio crackled with clear reception. This old bird had carried me through 17 combat missions without failing me once, and I trusted her completely. At 0930 hours, the ship's speakers crackled to life. "Now hear this, now hear this. All pilots man your planes. This is not a drill. All pilots man your planes." My heart began pounding as I made my final preparations. I checked my .38 revolver, made sure my life jacket was properly fastened, and adjusted my flight helmet one last time. Looking around the hangar deck, I could see dozens of other pilots going through the same ritual, each man dealing with pre-mission nerves in his own way. The elevator lifted our section of aircraft to the flight deck, and I was immediately hit by the controlled chaos that always preceded a major strike. Plane handlers in colored jerseys guided aircraft into position while ordnance men made final checks on bombs and ammunition. The air was thick with the smell of aviation fuel and exhaust fumes, mixed with the salt spray from the ocean rushing past below. I could see the other carriers of Task Force 58 spread out across the horizon: USS Essex, USS Intrepid, USS Yorktown, USS Langley, USS Cabot, and others. Each ship was launching its own strike packages, creating an aerial armada that would soon converge on the Japanese task force. The sight filled me with both pride and determination. This was American industrial and military might at its peak, the culmination of years of building, training, and fighting. At 1,000 hours sharp, the air boss's voice boomed over the ship's speakers. "Pilots, start your engines." The flight deck erupted in a thunderous roar as over 30 aircraft fired up simultaneously. My Helldiver's engine caught immediately, settling into a steady rumble that I could feel in my chest. I ran through the engine checks one more time. Oil pressure good, fuel pressure good, magnetos functioning properly. Everything was ready. Launch the strike, came the order, and one by one, aircraft began roaring down the deck and into the gray morning sky. When my turn came, I advanced the throttle to full power and released the brakes. The Helldiver accelerated down the deck, heavy with fuel and ordnance but eager to fly. At the bow, I pulled back on the stick and felt the familiar sensation of leaving the ship behind as I climbed into the overcast sky. Joining up with the rest of the strike group took nearly 20 minutes as aircraft from multiple carriers formed into attack formations. Flying through the thick cloud cover was like navigating through a gray maze. One moment you'd be in clear air, the next surrounded by moisture so thick you couldn't see your own wingtips. Lieutenant Commander Peterson, our strike leader, had been flying combat missions since the early days at Guadalcanal. His voice came through the radio calm and steady. "Stay tight, boys. Weather's getting worse, but intelligence reports the Japanese task force is maintaining course and speed. We should have them in sight in about 90 minutes. As we flew southwest toward the Japanese home islands, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we'd come. 3.5 years ago, the Japanese Navy had been the undisputed master of the Pacific. Their carriers had struck Pearl Harbor with impunity, their battleships had dominated the night battles around Guadalcanal, and their Zero fighters had seemed invincible. Now, in April 1945, we were hunting their greatest warship with an air armada so large it blackened the sky. The transformation hadn't been easy. Every mile of ocean we'd crossed had been paid for in blood. I'd lost too many good friends, shot down over enemy territory, killed in deck crashes, or simply listed as missing in action when they failed to return from a mission. But each loss had only strengthened our resolve. We were no longer fighting just to win. We were fighting to end this war as quickly as possible and prevent more American casualties. At 11:45 hours, Peterson's voice crackled through the radio with the words we'd all been waiting for. Tally-ho. Japanese task force bearing 270, distance 15 miles. I count one large battleship, one cruiser, and multiple destroyers. All aircraft. This is it. Attack, attack, attack. Through a gap in the clouds, I caught my first glimpse of the Yamato, and the sight took my breath away. Even from 15 miles out, she looked absolutely massive, a steel mountain cutting through the gray seas. Her distinctive pagoda-style superstructure rose like a skyscraper from her deck, and her 3 main gun turrets were trained toward the sky, ready to throw up a wall of anti-aircraft fire. But it was her sheer size that was most intimidating. At 863 feet long and 127 feet wide, she dwarfed every other warship I'd ever seen. Her gray hull gleamed with fresh paint, and battle flags streamed from her masts in defiance of the approaching doom. This was the ship the Japanese believed to be unsinkable, the floating symbol of their empire's power. First section, take the battleship, Peterson ordered. Second and third sections, hit the escorts. Watch out for flak. Intelligence says they've got over 150 anti-aircraft guns down there. As if summoned by his words, the sky around us suddenly erupted in black puffs of smoke as the Japanese ships opened fire with every anti-aircraft gun they possessed. The sound was like thunder, and the concussions from near misses buffeted our aircraft like leaves in a hurricane. The anti-aircraft fire from the Japanese task force was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The sky filled with black smoke puffs as shells exploded all around us, each one capable of tearing an aircraft apart. Tracers streaked past my cockpit in streams of red and orange, and I could hear shrapnel rattling off my aircraft's aluminum skin. "Holy cow," came Lieutenant Morrison's voice over the radio. "They've got enough flak down there to walk on." He wasn't exaggerating. The Japanese had concentrated every anti-aircraft weapon in the task force into a coordinated defense. The Yamato alone mounted 24 5-inch guns, 162 25mm guns, and dozens of smaller weapons. Combined with the guns from her escorts, they were throwing up a wall of steel that seemed impossible to penetrate. But penetrate it we did. American pilots had been flying through Japanese flak for 3.5 years, and we'd learned how to minimize our exposure while maximizing our effectiveness. The key was speed, surprise, and coordination. Hit them from multiple directions simultaneously so they couldn't concentrate their fire on any single group of attackers. I pushed my Helldiver into a steep dive, angling toward Yamato's massive deck. At 12,000 feet, I could see her clearly now, every detail of her superstructure, every gun mount, every antenna. She was turning hard to port, trying to present a smaller target, but at her size, evasive maneuvers were limited. Her wake carved a white foam trail through the dark water as her engines strained to give her every ounce of speed. At 8,000 feet, I had to start my bombing run. The flak was getting heavier now, closer, more accurate. A shell burst just off my port wing, and the concussion nearly flipped my aircraft over. I fought the controls, keeping the dive angle steady despite the turbulence. In my bomb sight, Yamato's deck grew larger and larger, filling my vision with gray steel and dark gun barrels. At 3,000 feet, I could see individual sailors running across her deck, their white uniforms standing out against the gray paint. Some were manning anti-aircraft guns. Others were damage control parties preparing for the inevitable hits. I felt a momentary pang of sympathy for them. They were just sailors doing their duty like we were. But then I remembered Pearl Harbor, Bataan, the thousands of American servicemen who had died because of Japanese aggression, and my finger tightened on the bomb release. At 2,500 feet, I pickled the bomb and immediately pulled out of the dive, my aircraft groaning under the G-forces. Behind me, my 1,000-pound bomb fell toward its target, followed by dozens of others from the rest of the strike group. I didn't see where mine hit. Pulling out of a dive bombing run, you're too busy fighting the controls and getting away from the flak to watch the results. But I felt the explosions. Even at 3 miles altitude, the shock waves from multiple bomb hits on Yamato's deck reached my aircraft. Looking back, I could see flames and smoke rising from her superstructure, and her anti-aircraft fire seemed to slacken momentarily. "Good hits on the battleship," Peterson's voice crackled through the radio. "I count at least 6 direct hits on the superstructure and deck. She's burning, but she's still making way." All aircraft regrouped for a second attack. As our first wave regrouped for another attack, the Yamato demonstrated why she had been feared throughout the Pacific. Despite the damage from our initial bombing run, her main batteries swiveled toward our formation and opened fire. The sight of those massive 18.1-inch guns firing at aircraft was both terrifying and surreal. Each gun was over 70 feet long and could fire a shell weighing nearly 3,200 pounds. When they fired, the muzzle flash lit up the overcast sky like lightning, and the sound was like the crack of doom itself. The shells weren't aimed at individual aircraft. Instead, they were fired to create massive explosions in the air that would hopefully bring down multiple planes at once. When those huge shells detonated, they created shock waves that could flip an aircraft upside down or tear its wings clean off. Morrison's voice came through the radio as a salvo of main battery shells exploded about 500 yards to our left. "They're shooting at us with the big guns." It was a desperate tactic, and not very effective against fast-moving aircraft, but it showed just how determined the Japanese were to fight their way through to Okinawa. Every gun on every ship in the task force was firing at us, creating a cone of destruction that we had to fly through to deliver our attacks. During this second attack run, I could see that our first wave had indeed inflicted serious damage. Smoke was pouring from holes in Yamato's superstructure, and her forward turret seemed to be training slowly, as if the machinery had been damaged. Several of her anti-aircraft gun positions were silent, their crews either dead or their weapons destroyed. But she was far from finished. As I lined up for another bombing run, her remaining guns concentrated their fire on my section. The flak was so thick it looked like a black cloud, and tracers created a deadly web of light around my aircraft. A 5-inch shell exploded so close that it peppered my port wing with shrapnel, but the tough old Helldivers kept flying. At 4,000 feet, I could see torpedo planes from USS Intrepid making their attack runs. Flying low and slow, they were sitting ducks for the anti-aircraft fire, but they pressed home their attacks with incredible courage. I watched one TBF Avenger take a direct hit from a 25mm gun and cartwheel into the sea, but his wingman continued the attack and put his torpedo into Yamato's port side. The explosion from that torpedo hit sent a column of water higher than the ship's superstructure. For a moment, I thought we might have broken her back, but the massive battleship absorbed the hit and continued making way toward Okinawa. My second bomb missed, exploding in the water about 50 yards off her starboard bow. But other pilots were finding their mark. I could see at least 4 more fires burning on her deck, and her list to port was becoming more pronounced. She was hurt, but like a wounded bear, she was becoming more dangerous, not less. At 14:30 hours, just as our fuel was getting critically low and we were preparing to return to our carriers, the second wave of American aircraft appeared through the clouds. Over 100 additional planes from 6 more carriers, Helldivers, Corsairs, Hellcats, and Avengers, swept down on the increasingly desperate Japanese task force. By now, the destroyer Kamikaze had been sunk by the first wave, and the light cruiser Yahagi was burning heavily, enlisting to starboard. But the Yamato continued to fight, her massive hull absorbing punishment that would have sunk any other warship. The fresh aircraft of the second wave attacked with renewed fury. I watched from high above as torpedo planes went in low from multiple directions, forcing the Yamato to turn into some torpedoes while exposing her vulnerable flanks to others. The coordination was beautiful and deadly. While the torpedo planes held her attention low on the water, dive bombers screamed down from high altitude to plant their bombs on her increasingly damaged deck. Lieutenant Commander Peterson's voice came over the radio. All first-wave aircraft return to base. Our fuel is too low for another attack. Good hunting, second wave, finish her off. As we turned northeast toward our carriers, I took one last look at the death struggle below. The Yamato was surrounded by towering columns of water from near-miss bombs and torpedo explosions. Smoke obscured most of her superstructure, and she was listing heavily to port. But she was still moving, still fighting, still trying to complete her suicide mission to Okinawa. The Japanese had built her to be unsinkable, and she was putting up the fight of her life to live up to that reputation. The flight back to the task force was tense. Our fuel gauges were deep in the red zone, and several aircraft had battle damage that made long-range flight questionable. Morrison's Helldiver had taken a direct hit from a 25mm gun that had knocked out his radio and damaged his engine, forcing him to fly on my wing and follow me home. But as we approached the American carriers, I felt a surge of pride at what we had accomplished. We'd found the most powerful battleship in the world and delivered a beating that would have sunk any other warship. Whether we'd actually sunk her remained to be seen, but there was no question that we'd prevented her from reaching Okinawa. Landing back aboard the USS Bunker Hill with battle damage and minimal fuel was one of the most challenging things I'd ever done as a pilot. The approach had to be perfect. Too high, and I'd missed the arresting cables. Too low, and I'd slam into the stern. With my engine running roughly from flak damage, there was no margin for error. The landing signal officer guided me in with hand signals, and I caught the number 3 wire perfectly. As my aircraft jerked to a stop, deck crews swarmed over it, checking for damage and refueling for the next mission. But there wouldn't be a next mission that day. Within minutes, reports began coming in from the second wave that changed everything. "She's going down," the message crackled through the ship's speakers at 14:23 hours. "The Yamato is capsizing." Repeat, "The Yamato is going down." The entire ship erupted in cheers. Sailors poured out of hatches and compartments, everyone wanting to hear the details of how the mighty Yamato had finally been brought to her knees. In the ready room, pilots from the second wave began filing in with incredible stories of the battleship's final minutes. Lieutenant Ted Wilson from USS Essex had been flying a Corsair in the final attack. His voice shook as he described what he'd seen. She took at least 12 torpedo hits on her port side and probably 20 direct bomb hits on her superstructure and deck. You could see secondary explosions going off inside her as the fires reached her magazines. She was listing over 30 degrees to port and couldn't recover. Another pilot, Ensign Dave Thompson from USS Intrepid, had been flying a torpedo plane during the coup de grace. I went in from her starboard side while she was already listing heavily to port. My torpedo hit her amidships, and I swear you could see the hull plates buckle from the explosion. By the time I climbed away, she was rolling over on her side. The most dramatic account came from Lieutenant Jim Patterson, a dive bomber pilot from USS Yorktown who had been attacking when the end came. She rolled completely over, showing her entire bottom to the sky. You could see her massive propellers still turning as she went under. Then the magazines went up, the biggest explosion I've ever seen. The fireball rose over 1,000 feet into the air, and the shock wave nearly knocked my plane out of the sky. As the reports came in, the full scope of our victory became clear. The Yamato had capsized and exploded at 14:23 hours, taking 2,498 of her 2,767-man crew with her. The light cruiser Yahagi had been sunk 20 minutes earlier with the loss of 446 men. 4 destroyers, Kamikaze, Isokaze, Kasumi, and Asashimo, had also been sent to the bottom. Only 4 destroyers from the original task force of 10 ships had survived to limp back to Japan. But the human cost of Operation 10 Go went beyond just numbers. Among the dead was Admiral Seiichi Ito, commander of the task force, who had gone down with his flagship. Captain Kosaku Aruga, the Yamato's commanding officer, had also chosen to stay with his ship rather than abandon her in her final moments. As the initial celebration died down, the strategic implications of what we had accomplished began to sink in. The sinking of the Yamato wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a psychological blow that would reverberate throughout the Japanese Empire. Commander Johnson called all aircrew to the ready room for a debrief that evening. His normally stern expression showed a hint of satisfaction as he addressed the assembled pilots. "Gentlemen, what you accomplished today will be remembered as one of the decisive moments of this war," he began. "The Japanese people have been told for years that the Yamato was unsinkable, that she represented the invincible spirit of their empire. Her loss, combined with the complete failure of Operation 10 Go, will send a clear message throughout Japan. If American air power can sink their greatest battleship, nothing in their arsenal can stand against us." He was right. The sinking of the Yamato marked the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force. They had gambled their last major warship in a desperate attempt to disrupt the Okinawa invasion, and they had lost everything. With her destruction, Japan's ability to project naval power beyond their home islands was essentially eliminated. But the victory came at a cost for us as well. We had lost 10 aircraft and 12 aircrew during the 2 waves of attacks. Each loss was felt deeply by those of us who returned. These weren't just numbers, they were friends, squadron mates, men who had shared the dangers and hardships of carrier warfare for months or years. Lieutenant Bobby Chen from our squadron had been shot down during the second wave. His Helldiver had taken a direct hit from a 5-inch shell while making a bombing run on the cruiser Yahagi. I'd seen his plane explode, but in the heat of battle, there hadn't been time to look for parachutes. Now, back on the carrier, his empty bunk in our compartment served as a stark reminder that victory always came with a price. Later that evening, as I stood on the flight deck watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of orange and red, I found myself thinking about the men we had fought that day. The Japanese sailors aboard the Yamato had shown incredible courage in the face of overwhelming odds. They had known from the beginning that theirs was a one-way mission, yet they had fought with determination until the very end. In the weeks that followed, intelligence reports would reveal just how desperate Japan's situation had become. The decision to sacrifice the Yamato in Operation 10 Go had been made at the highest levels of the Japanese government, including Emperor Hirohito himself. They had hoped that the massive battleship could beach herself on Okinawa and use her 18.1-inch guns to destroy American transports and landing craft, potentially forcing us to abandon the invasion. It had been a plan born of desperation rather than sound military strategy. The task force had been given only enough fuel for a one-way trip, no air cover, and no realistic hope of survival. Yet the Japanese had convinced themselves that the symbolic value of the Yamato sacrifice would somehow turn the tide of the war. The reality was far different. Instead of disrupting our invasion of Okinawa, the loss of the Yamato had actually strengthened American resolve. The knowledge that we had destroyed Japan's most powerful warship with air power alone demonstrated the complete supremacy of American naval aviation. It showed that the age of the battleship was truly over, and that carriers would dominate naval warfare from this point forward. From a tactical standpoint, our success at sinking the Yamato validated years of development in carrier aviation and coordinated strike tactics. The attack had involved perfect coordination between multiple carrier air groups, with precise timing and execution that maximized our effectiveness while minimizing our losses. It was American military technology and training at its finest. The weeks following the sinking of the Yamato were filled with continued combat operations as the battle for Okinawa raged on. Every day brought new sorties against Japanese positions on the island, and every night brought the terror of kamikaze attacks against our fleet. The Japanese were fighting with the desperation of a cornered animal, throwing everything they had at us in a last-ditch effort to prevent the invasion of their homeland. But something had changed after April 7th. There was a sense among the aircrew that we had passed a turning point, that the Japanese had shot their last bolt and come up short. The sinking of the Yamato had been their final card, their last chance to inflict a decisive blow on American forces. Its failure seemed to drain the fight out of even the most fanatical Japanese defenders. I continued flying combat missions throughout April and May, attacking enemy positions on Okinawa and providing close air support for our ground forces. Each mission reinforced the lesson we had learned during the attack on the Yamato. American air power was now so overwhelming that Japanese forces could not hope to stand against it in open battle. The statistics told the story clearly. During the two-wave attack on the Yamato, we had launched 386 aircraft from 11 different carriers. The coordination required to get that many planes from that many ships to arrive over the target simultaneously was staggering. It demonstrated not just American industrial might, but the sophisticated training and doctrine that had evolved over 3.5 years of carrier warfare. Against this aerial armada, the Japanese had been able to deploy exactly 0 fighter aircraft. Their remaining carriers had no planes, their airfields on Kyushu were under constant attack, and their pilot training program had been reduced to sending teenagers on suicide missions with minimal flight time. The contrast with 1942, when Japanese pilots had been among the best in the world, was stark and telling. As May turned to June and the battle for Okinawa finally wound down, I found myself thinking more and more about what the war had cost both sides. The Japanese had lost not just the Yamato, but an entire generation of their best sailors and pilots. Their cities were being burned to ash by B-29 raids. Their merchant marine had been virtually eliminated by submarine attacks, and their population was slowly starving as our blockade tightened around their home islands. On our side, the victory had been expensive as well. The battle for Okinawa alone cost us over 12,000 American lives, and the prospect of invading Japan itself promised casualties that would dwarf even that terrible toll. Every American serviceman in the Pacific understood that the end of the war was coming, but we also understood that the final battles would be the bloodiest of all. By late June 1945, it was clear that Japan could not continue fighting much longer. Their navy had been reduced to a handful of submarines and small craft. Their air force existed mainly on paper, and their army was running short of everything from ammunition to food. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August merely confirmed what many of us had already realized. Japan's position was hopeless. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, I was aboard the USS Bunker Hill off the coast of Japan, preparing for what we expected to be the invasion of the home islands. Instead, we found ourselves preparing for occupation duty, a role none of us had really expected to survive long enough to fulfill. The formal surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd was broadcast throughout the Pacific Fleet, and I listened to it with a mixture of relief, pride, and sadness. Relief that the killing was finally over, pride in what American forces had accomplished, and sadness for all the friends who hadn't lived to see this day. As General MacArthur accepted the Japanese surrender, I thought about the long road we had traveled since Pearl Harbor. In December 1941, the Japanese Navy had seemed invincible, their pilots the finest in the world, their ships the most advanced, their strategy flawless in execution. Now, less than 4 years later, that same Navy lay on the bottom of the Pacific, its greatest battleship destroyed by American air power in a battle that lasted less than 2 hours. The sinking of the Yamato had been both symbolic and practical. Symbolically, it marked the end of Japan's dreams of empire and the futility of their resistance to American power. Practically, it demonstrated the complete dominance of carrier aviation over traditional naval gunnery. The battleship era that had dominated naval warfare since the late 19th century was over, replaced by the age of the aircraft carrier. 78 years have passed since that gray April morning when we sent the Yamato to the bottom of the East China Sea. As I write this, I'm one of the few surviving pilots who participated in that historic attack, and the memories are as vivid now as they were then. The Battle of the East China Sea, as historians have dubbed it, lasted just 2 hours but changed naval warfare forever. It proved that no surface ship, regardless of size or armor, could survive concentrated attack by carrier-based aircraft. It validated the American doctrine of carrier aviation that had evolved through 3.5 years of Pacific warfare. Most importantly, it broke the back of Japanese naval resistance and hastened the end of World War II. The human cost of that victory is something I've never forgotten. Over 3,700 Japanese sailors died when their ships were sunk, most of them young men no different from ourselves, fighting for their country as they understood their duty. On our side, 12 American aircrew gave their lives to ensure that the Yamato never reached Okinawa. Every one of those losses was mourned by squadron mates who understood that it could just as easily have been them. But the strategic result of Operation 10 Go's failure cannot be understated. By preventing the Yamato from reaching Okinawa, we ensured that the invasion of that island could continue without the threat of 18.1-inch shells falling among our transport ships. The successful capture of Okinawa, in turn, provided the final stepping stone for the planned invasion of Japan itself. More importantly, the psychological impact of the Yamato's destruction rippled throughout the Japanese Empire. For years, the Japanese people had been told that their great battleship was unsinkable, a floating fortress that embodied the invincible spirit of their nation. When news of her sinking reached Japan, it shattered that mythology and made clear to even the most optimistic Japanese that their position was hopeless. Intelligence reports intercepted after the war revealed the full extent of the shock felt in Tokyo. Emperor Hirohito himself was reportedly devastated by the news, calling it a grievous blow to the nation's morale. High-ranking naval officers who had staked their careers on battleship supremacy found themselves marginalized as the reality of American air power became undeniable. The tactical lessons learned during the attack on the Yamato would influence naval warfare for generations to come. The coordination of multiple carrier air groups, the use of mixed attack formations with dive bombers and torpedo planes, and the concentration of overwhelming force at the decisive point became standard doctrine for the U.S. Navy. These principles would be refined and perfected during the Cold War and beyond. Looking back on that April day in 1945, I'm struck by how much the world has changed since then. The aircraft carriers that dominated the Pacific have given way to nuclear-powered supercarriers with capabilities we could never have imagined. The propeller-driven aircraft we flew have been replaced by jets that can break the sound barrier. The bombs we dropped by hand have been superseded by precision-guided munitions that can hit targets from hundreds of miles away. But some things haven't changed. The courage required to fly into enemy fire, the dedication of maintenance crews who keep aircraft flying under impossible conditions, and the brotherhood forged between men who faced death together remain constants in military aviation. The young sailors and airmen serving today carry forward the same traditions of honor, courage, and commitment that drove us to victory in World War II. The Yamato lies today in 2 pieces on the bottom of the East China Sea, 1,200 feet below the surface. Her massive guns, once the most feared weapons in the Pacific, are silent and covered with marine growth. Japanese divers have visited the wreck several times, paying their respects to the 2,498 sailors who went down with their ship. There's something fitting about that. Even in victory, we can honor the courage of those who fought against us. In 1985, 40 years after the battle, I had the opportunity to meet Captain Mitsuru Yoshida, one of the few Japanese survivors of the Yamato sinking. He had been a young ensign at the time, serving in the ship's communications section. We spent an afternoon together in Tokyo, two old men sharing memories of a battle that had shaped both our lives. "Your pilots fought with great skill," he told me through an interpreter. "We knew from the moment we saw your aircraft that we were facing our doom. But we fought anyway, because that was our duty." I understood exactly what he meant. Duty had driven all of us that day, Japanese and American alike. The difference was that American duty was backed by superior training, better equipment, and more sound strategy. But the courage displayed by both sides was equal and deserving of respect. As I conclude this account, I'm reminded of something Admiral Chester Nimitz said after the war. The Battle of the East China Sea was not won by any single pilot or aircrew, but by the collective effort of thousands of Americans who built the ships, trained the pilots, and supported the fleet that made victory possible. That's the real lesson of April 7, 1945. American victory was achieved not through individual heroics, but through the combined strength of a democratic society united in common cause. The young lookout who jumped from the Yamato as she exploded probably never knew the names of the American pilots who sank his ship. We were anonymous enemies to each other, separated by language, culture, and ideology. But we were bound together by the shared experience of combat, the knowledge that we had all done our duty as we understood it. Today, Japan and the United States are close allies, partners in maintaining peace and stability in the Pacific. The ocean where we once fought to the death is now crossed by merchant ships and passenger aircraft carrying trade and tourists between our nations. The transformation from bitter enemies to trusted friends is perhaps the greatest victory of all, proof that even the most destructive conflicts can lead eventually to understanding and cooperation. The sinking of the Yamato marked not just the end of Japanese naval power, but the beginning of a new era in which American leadership would help rebuild the Pacific into a region of prosperity and peace. The sailors who died that day, both American and Japanese, made the ultimate sacrifice for their countries. Our duty to their memory is to ensure that the peace their sacrifice helped achieve is preserved for future generations. On quiet evenings, when I stand on my porch and look out toward the Pacific, I sometimes think I can still hear the rumble of aircraft engines and the sound of bombs exploding in the distance. The ghosts of that April day will be with me until I join my fallen squadron mates. But they are not haunting ghosts. They are reminders of what ordinary men can accomplish when they are fighting for something greater than themselves. The Yamato was indeed a mighty warship, the largest and most powerful battleship ever built. But she was no match for the combined might of American industrial power, naval aviation, and the indomitable spirit of free men fighting for their country. Her destruction marked the end of an era and the beginning of American naval supremacy that continues to this day. That is the true legacy of April 7, 1945, not just the sinking of one ship, but the triumph of democracy over tyranny, of innovation over tradition, and of the many over the few. It was a victory worth the price we paid, and a memory worth preserving for all time. But the strategic result of Operation 10 Go's failure cannot be understated. By preventing the Yamato from reaching Okinawa, we ensured that the invasion of that island could continue without the threat of 18.1-inch shells falling among our transport ships. The successful capture of Okinawa, in turn, provided the